Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing chronic gastritis and peptic ulcers. Okay, so we're in the process of discussing the histology of the stomach wall. Okay, so we've discussed that the stomach wall is lined by these columnar epithelial cells. Now, the columnar epithelial cells, which are not within gastric pits or gastric glands, are called surface columnar epithelial cells or surface mucus cells because they secrete mucus. And the other name for these surface mucus cells is to call them foveolar cells. The cells which actually do line gastric pits and gastric glands, those are now known as neck mucus cells or neck columnar epithelial cells. Okay, so that's just to distinguish the epithelial cells which actually face into the lumen from those which face into a gastric pit. Okay, right. So, now what we need to discuss is the special cells which are interdispersed among the columnar epithelial cells, okay? And these special cells will secrete more interesting things than just mucus. So, we will begin with a type of cell which is found within the gastric glands within the antrum of the stomach. So I will colour this in turquoise to match the colour that I coloured in the antrum here. So this next type of cell is only found within the gastric antrum. Okay, and we'll see the significance of these cells later on. Okay, so they're found right at the base of the gastric glands, like so, okay? And these are Gastrin cells, okay? And for short, Gastrin cells are often just called G cells, so Gastrin/G cells. Okay, so right at the bottom of the gastric/oxyntic glands, in the antrum of the stomach, you have these gastrin cells, and they will secrete gastrin, as we'll see later. But you don't have these elsewhere in the stomach. They won't be found in the body of the stomach, or the fundus of the stomach, or the cardia of the stomach. Okay, now other cells which you have lining the gastric glands you also have a special type of cell known as the chief cells or the peptic cells, and these won't just be present in the antrum of the stomach, and I'm just going to make a note of that. So these are within the antrum, whereas everything we're going to discuss now is found more generally in the wall of the stomach. So it's only those that are specialized to this one location. Okay, so the next cells we're going to discuss are these chief/peptic cells. Now these are a little bit further up than the G cells, but they're still quite far down in the gastric glands. Okay, so here these are the chief/peptic cells. Now what do the chief/peptic cells secrete? Well, they secrete the precursors to the protease enzymes. So, the main precursor they secrete is a protein which is called pepsinogen. Okay, pepsinogen is the precursor to the enzyme pepsin. Okay, so pepsinogen can be converted into pepsin, and then pepsin is a protease which cleaves peptide bonds between two amino acids within a polypeptide. The other precursor to a protease enzyme which these chief/peptic cells can secrete is prorenin, okay? And this will then be converted to the protease enzyme renin. Now, you may hear renin and think of one of two things. You might be thinking of, isn't that something that cows have within their stomach, okay? And isn't that used to make cheese? Well, yes, it used to be used to make cheese. It's no longer used to make cheese unless you buy very, very expensive cheese. It won't be used anymore. Most cheese is suitable for vegetarians. Okay, you might be wondering, well, this isn't present in humans, is it? And the answer is no, not generally. But in infant humans, it is present. So infant humans, their chief/peptic cells will produce prorenin, which will be activated to renin, okay? And renin performs a similar function to pepsin. It's a protease which will cut peptide bonds between amino acids. Okay, the other thing you might be thinking of is, isn't this part of regulating body fluid volume? No, is the answer. That is renin, okay? Now, really, this should be pronounced renin to distinguish it from renin, which it has the double N here and the single N here, okay? But people often pronounce this as renin rather than renin. Now, this renin or renin with the single N is part of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which does regulate body fluid volume. Okay, this is not the same as this. Okay, so double N versus single N, they are not the same thing. Okay, this is a protease found in the stomach. This is an enzyme which probably has a very similar activity, i.e. it is a protease because it actually does cleave angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. However, it's not the same enzyme, basically. So we're not interested in this one, we're interested in this one. Okay, so the chief/peptic cells in adult humans will secrete pepsinogen, which will be converted into pepsin, which is our functional protease enzyme. And in infant humans, you'll also secrete prorenin, which will be converted into renin in the lumen of the stomach, and this will then break down protein similarly. Right, so that's the function of the chief/peptic cells. The next important cell we need to discuss are the parietal cells. And I'll colour these in not pink, I've already used pink, in blue, I think. So, the parietal cells are quite high up in the gastric glands, so they're almost at the junction between the gastric glands and the gastric pits above. Okay, so in blue, these represent the parietal cells. And again, I will stress that it's the G cells that are specialized to the, specially located in the antrum. The chief/peptic cells and the parietal cells, which are also called oxyntic cells, these are found more generally in most of the locations of the stomach. Okay, so parietal/oxyntic cells. Okay, now, what is the function of the parietal/oxyntic cells? Well, they have two functions. One of their functions is to secrete hydrochloric acid. Okay, so these are responsible for the secretion of hydrochloric acid into the gastric glands, which will then go into the gastric pits and then into the lumen of the stomach, resulting in the contents of the lumen of the stomach being extremely acidic, extremely low pH. Okay, and that low pH has two functions. Firstly, it's totally intolerant to life, basically. Cells cannot live in a pH of 1. Okay, that's the pH or therearound of the stomach lumen. Now that's far too high for cells to live in, basically. So any bacterial cells which come down the esophagus, in principle, will be annihilated. Although, as we'll see, chronic gastritis is going to result because of bacteria living on the surface of the stomach. And you might ask, well, how are they capable of doing this? They do it the same way as the columnar epithelial cells do it. They shield themselves with the mucus, so these bacteria are going to live within the mucus. And the mucus, amazingly, has a pH of around 6 to 7, and that's thanks to the bicarbonate, basically. Okay, right. That's one of the functions of the parietal/oxyntic cells, and we were just discussing the other function of the hydrochloric acid. So we said that one function of the hydrochloric acid was to protect you against bacterial infection. The other function is that that's the optimal pH for the protease enzymes to work. Okay, so not only is it there to help as part of the innate immune system, but also to help with digestion, basically. Okay, right. The other function of the parietal/oxyntic cells is that they also secrete something called intrinsic factor. Okay, now intrinsic factor is actually, I remember my physiology lecturer in first year of medical school telling me that the only essential function that the stomach performs is the secretion of intrinsic factor. If you take the stomach out, the only problem that you get is that nothing then secretes intrinsic factor. Now, why is intrinsic factor so important? Well, basically, without intrinsic factor, you cannot absorb vitamin B12, okay? And the other name for vitamin B12 is cobalamin. Now, this is the vitamin, another important thing about this vitamin is it's the one that vegetarians, actually not vegetarians, vegans, cannot get within their diet, basically, and therefore have to take supplements. And the controversy over this used to be, well, where does the cobalamin come from that's in the supplements? Now, of course, we have ways of producing it that don't involve animals, but that's beside the point. Okay, so intrinsic factor basically is essential for the absorption of vitamin B12 or cobalamin. Okay, and without intrinsic factor, you don't absorb vitamin B12 or cobalamin. So, if you take the stomach out, the problem is you become B12 deficient, basically. But that's the only problem that you get, basically. This is, according to my first-year physiology teacher, the only essential function that the stomach performs, because the digestion of proteins can be done within the intestine. There are protease enzymes secreted by the pancreas as well, so you don't need it to occur within the stomach. Okay, right. So, the parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Now, for us, the important thing is going to be hydrochloric acid. We're going to forget about intrinsic factor, despite how important it is. Right. Okay, so we've now completed this outermost layer of the stomach wall, which is the layer of epithelial cells, the layer which actually faces the contents of the lumen. Okay, now what are all of these cells sitting on? Well, basically they're sitting on a basement membrane, as with all epithelia. Okay, so underneath them all there is a protein meshwork that mainly consists of collagen, but also has other proteins such as fibrilin and laminins within it. Okay, and this meshwork is called the basement membrane. And I'm drawing it here in turquoise. Right, so that in turquoise represents the basement membrane. Whoops. So this is the basement membrane. Now, what do you then have underneath the basement membrane? Well, you have another layer of connective tissue known as the lamina propria. Okay, now, before discussing the lamina propria, it's actually easier to discuss the Muscularis mucosae and then come back to the lamina propria. So that's what I'm going to do. So, underneath all of this, you then have the Muscularis mucosae, which is a thin layer of smooth muscle cells. Okay, so this here, this is the Muscularis mucosae. Okay, and this is a very, very thin layer of smooth muscle cells. Now, this is not the proper layer of smooth muscle cells that surrounds the stomach. If you've ever done anatomy, you will know that the stomach is very, very muscular. Okay, this is not that huge layer of muscle that you have around the stomach. This is a pathetic little dwarf of a layer compared to those layers. We'll come to Muscularis propria in a moment. Okay, this is a thin layer that is very close to the mucosa, and well, it's actually part of the mucosa, and we'll discuss what the mucosa is in a moment. Okay, so here we have this thin layer of smooth muscle cells here. Okay, and to amplify the fact that they are smooth muscle cells, I will colour them in red. Right. Okay, now let's go back and talk about the lamina propria. The lamina propria is this layer of connective tissue which basically fills in the gap between the basement membrane and the Muscularis mucosae. Okay, so this layer will be a differing thickness depending on whether we are talking about a portion of the gastric wall where there is no gastric pit, such as up here, and then the lamina propria is very thick. But when there is a gastric pit and then gastric glands coming off the gastric pit, the lamina propria will be very thin, as we can see. Okay, because of the fact that the gastric pit invaginates down. So basically the lamina propria just makes up the gap between the basement membrane and the muscularis mucosae below. Okay, now within it there are some important cells, as we'll come back to later. There is a special type of cell which regulates the secretion of hydrochloric acid by the parietal /oxyntic cells, known as enterochromaffin-like cells, but we'll come back to that later. The lamina propria also contains nerves, for instance. It contains blood vessels which will be supplying the tissues of the epithelial layer. It will contain lymphatic vessels as well, things like that. Now, the mucosa then, the term mucosa means every single layer we have now discussed. It means this epithelial cell layer. It means the basement membrane, it means the lamina propria, and it means the muscularis mucosae. So all of these four layers together, those are all called the mucosa. Okay, so I'll put this word in big. So when people talk about the gastric mucosa, that is what they mean. Gastric means pertaining to the stomach. Mucosa means these four layers of the stomach wall, basically. Okay, now underneath the muscularis mucosae, you then have a layer of connective tissue, and because this layer of connective tissue is underneath the muscularis mucosae, or rather, because it's underneath the mucosa, it's underneath all four of these layers, it's known as the submucosa. Okay, now what does the submucosa contain? Well, it contains blood vessels, basically. It contains big arterioles and big venules. Now, notice that these are arterioles and venules, so they are still not that big. They are not these massive great things that you learn about in anatomy, okay, that you learn the names of even. These are tiny, basically, compared to those, but they are big compared to the blood vessels that you will actually have within the lamina propria. Okay, so they will give off smaller branches, and I'll try and show them smaller, that will go into the lamina propria, break up into even smaller branches, and then break up into capillaries. And the capillaries will then supply the cells of the lamina propria and the cells of the epithelium with nutrients, and then the capillaries will reconverge to form venules, the venules will reconverge to form a bigger venule, and then this bigger venule will then go back onto our biggest venule over here, which is in the submucosa. Okay, right, so the submucosa contains the bigger arterioles and venules, basically. Now, underneath the submucosa, we then have the beginning of what's called the muscularis propria. So, muscularis propria. Okay, or the proper muscular layer. So this is the thicker muscle layer that surrounds which is part of the wall of the stomach. Okay, so you can divide it into three separate layers. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Now the first is known as the oblique layer of smooth muscle cells. The second is known as the circular layer of smooth muscle cells, and the third is the longitudinal layer of smooth muscle cells. And basically what differs between these three layers is the orientation of the smooth muscle cells that are within them. Okay, so to show this, let's draw some big pictures of the macroscopic anatomy of the stomach. Okay, so here are some macroscopic pictures of the stomach. Oops. Okay, so basically, the orientation of the oblique smooth muscle cell fibers will be in this sort of direction. They'll be going diagonally, basically. So, longitudinally means in the direction of the movement of food. So basically, the food will move in this sort of direction, and that's considered the longitudinal axis. So these longitudinal fibers will be facing in that longitudinal axis. So I'll draw the final layer over here since I've let the cat out of the bag early. Okay, so here is the stomach. It's a shame it doesn't start with the longitudinal ones first so that I could begin with that one. Okay, so basically the longitudinal fibers will be going in this sort of direction towards the pyloric sphincter, basically. So they will be moving in the same direction as the food would be moving. Okay, so the longitudinal fibers, the fibers in this longitudinal layer of muscularis propria will be running in this direction. Oblique is kind of half-heartedly in that direction. It's sort of diagonal, okay? And then circular is then the most unlongitudinal, okay? So, if I draw the stomach again, like so, the circular fibres will be running around well, if you imagine the stomach as a tube, they will be going around that tube, basically. So they're going in this sort of direction, perpendicular to the longitudinal axis, basically. So they're encirculating the stomach, like so. Okay? So this is the circular smooth muscle cell fibres. So in the oblique layer, we have smooth muscle cells that are oriented in this sort of a direction. In the circular layer, we have them that are oriented in this direction. And then finally, in the longitudinal layer, we have smooth muscle cells which are oriented in this direction. Okay, right, so those are the three separate layers of Muscularis propria. And then outside of all of those layers, what you then have is a single layer of cells, okay, known as the serosa. Now basically this is the peritoneal covering of the stomach. So most of the abdominal organs are covered by the peritoneum, okay? And this basically is a single layer of cells, okay? So the stomach ends up covered by this single layer of cells, okay? So here, this is the serosa of the stomach. And basically these cells are often called a mesothelium, okay? So you wouldn't consider them an endothelium. You could consider them an epithelium, but specifically the fancy term for them is to call them a mesothelium. And the reason that they're called a mesothelium is that they are actually of mesodermal origin in embryology, okay? So basically, in embryological development, the pleural cavities, the pericardial cavities, and also the peritoneal cavities, those actually come from mesoderm rather than from ectoderm or endoderm. Okay, so the meso here reflects the fact that they are from the mesoderm, basically, rather than the ectoderm or the endoderm. Okay, right, so we'll call it there for this video, and in the next video what we'll do is take a closer look at these parietal cells here. Whoops, you can't actually see that. At these parietal cells here, and we want to look at how they secrete hydrochloric acid, and we also want to look at the control of the secretion of hydrochloric acid. And you might be thinking, well, why is this all necessary to discuss the pathology? Basically, it's going to help us out greatly when we want to discuss the pharmacology, okay, i.e. how you actually treat chronic gastritis and peptic ulcers. Okay, specifically peptic ulcers rather than chronic gastritis. Okay, so in the next video we'll discuss the physiology, then we'll move on to the pathology of chronic gastritis leading to peptic ulcers, and then we'll look at the pharmacology of peptic ulcers.